This is Truth in Media. I'm Ben Swan. So all across the country, cities and states have issued stay-at-home orders for at least the next 2 weeks. That means that you're being told to stay in your home, do not go out, unless, of course, you have to get food, you have to go to the grocery store, or you need medical care or medical supplies. Other than that, unless you're an essential worker, you're being told to stay at home. But while these quarantines are in place, here's a question for you. Is the Constitution, are our rights as American citizens also being quarantined? Because if you're paying attention, if you're awake, then you know it's happening. This is Truth in Media. So I want to talk to you about this issue of what's going on around the country. I called it in the beginning here a quarantine of our constitutional rights. That is actually happening right now. Now, we can have a debate about the reality of this coronavirus pandemic that's going around. As you know, I've been questioning some of the numbers and the harshness of the mortality rate. I do not believe it is as strong as what we're being told, that there's a lot of fear and a lot of hype surrounding this thing. We can go into more of that at a later time. But right now, one thing that is absolutely without question is the issue of our rights as American citizens and whether or not those rights, whether or not the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is being quarantined along with the rest of the population. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, leave it to any crisis for government to step in and try to take greater control over our lives. It happened after 9/11 when we had really the most unbelievably unconstitutional and obtrusive bill that's ever been passed in the United States, called the Patriot Act, that was passed with overwhelming support in both houses of Congress, and of course signed by President Bush at the time. And the Patriot Act still is in existence. It still is renewed every time it comes around. And the reason for that is because once government takes power, once they take away rights from American citizens, they rarely, if ever, give those rights back. They continue to take away freedoms, but they don't return those freedoms to you even after the so-called emergency is over with. And right now, during this so-called pandemic, the same thing is happening all over again. The latest case of this, have you seen this? An article by Politico that says that the Trump administration, and specifically the Department of Justice under Attorney General Bill Barr, is seeking to have indefinite detention of anyone who's arrested granted by the courts. And what they're asking for, people who are arrested, that citizens who are arrested, just be able to be held or be allowed to be held, detained indefinitely. The Department of Justice is requesting that Congress allow any chief judge of a district court to, quote, pause court proceedings whenever the district is fully or partially closed by virtue of any natural disaster, civil disobedience, or other emergency situation. According to draft language obtained by Politico, this would be applicable to any statutes or rules of procedure otherwise affecting pre-arrest, post-arrest, pre-trial, trial, and post-trial procedures in criminal and juvenile proceedings and all civil processes and proceedings. They justify this by saying that currently judges can pause judicial proceedings in an emergency, but that new legislation would allow them to apply it in a consistent manner. So here's the problem with specifically what's being asked for here, is that the DOJ is asking courts to essentially give them the right to violate the Constitution. Under the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, we have something called habeas corpus. What is that? Well, habeas corpus gives arrestees the right to appear in front of a judge and ask to be released before trial. You have that right in this country if you are arrested. Enacting legislation, like what the DOJ is specifically asking for here, would essentially suspend habeas corpus indefinitely until an emergency situation has been resolved. Now, you say, well, listen, we're under the pandemic right now of the coronavirus, and so even if this were to happen, you know, an emergency would come to an end, and then everything goes back to normal. But does it? Does it really? Because if you think back again as to the example of 9/11, which I brought up before, and the Patriot Act, remember all these powers that were given to the federal government, given to essentially spook agencies like the CIA and the NSA and the FBI? They were given these powers under the Patriot Act for surveillance. They were given these powers because we were in an emergency situation thanks to 9/11 and attacks on U.S. soil. And here we are, almost 20 years later, and the Patriot Act has not left us. And the emergency situation that came along as a result of 9/11, called the War on Terror, has not only not gone away, it's only been expanded over time. It has become a permanent part of our society and our culture. So understand this. Any laws that are enacted, any rules that are changed as a result of an emergency are going to stay with us after the fact. So there's another thing that's in this request by the DOJ. They are asking for video teleconferencing to be used during an appearance of a person who's been arrested before a judge. But here's what's really interesting here. In the draft of the potential language for this, the Federal Rule of Committee Procedure, they have crossed out the phrase, if the defendant consents. Essentially saying that they want a new rule for teleconferencing where a judge doesn't even have to be present and you don't have to be before that judge. Originally, the language had said, if you consent as the person who's been arrested, but they've crossed all that out saying, your rights don't matter, your rights are not important. So this is essentially a violation of the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. Essentially, that right to due process being violated by what the DOJ is specifically asking for. Again, indefinite detention of people who are arrested pre-arrest, pre-trial. That essentially you can be arrested and held indefinitely without ever seeing a judge as long as any kind of national emergency or civil disobedience is taking place. That's insane. And it completely flies in the face of our Bill of Rights. If this is allowed to happen, then why do we even have a Bill of Rights? You're essentially saying if there's an emergency, then my rights don't matter anymore. They can be suspended, they can be taken from me, and it's not important. And by the way, this has happened many times in our country's past. It happened during World War II, where people had their rights taken away. Japanese Americans were placed into internment camps in the United States because, against their constitutional rights, because of fear and because of an emergency situation. But just because we're in an emergency does not make it right. But there are other examples of this as well. How about the fact that we have mayors and governors in different states that are trying to take away Second Amendment rights during this time? We literally have a situation right now where you have governors and you have mayors of cities who are saying that they have the authority to unilaterally ban the sales of firearms in their state or in their city, and that they have the right to suspend background checks during this time, suspend the ability of Americans to be able to go out and purchase firearms. Why? Because they say we're in a crisis situation. It's an emergency right now. Never mind the fact that in a lot of different cities, like Philadelphia, you have the suspension of arrests of people who are committing crimes. Because essentially the city is saying we don't want to put our prison populations at risk of coronavirus. So they're actually telling police officers to not arrest people who are committing crimes. But simultaneously, you have cities saying we're also going to block citizens from purchasing firearms of their own to protect themselves. So the police aren't going to protect you, but you won't be allowed to either. Again, this is a quarantine, if you will, of the Second Amendment that allows this to happen. There's another example of a Fourth Amendment violation that's taking place, and that is where you have tech companies actually working with federal agencies to monitor your behavior using your Amazon Alexa, for instance, to listen in on what you're doing and to monitor your behavior to decide whether or not you are, in fact, contagious and whether or not you are traveling or moving about. In fact, if you look at some of what's happening, the government right now is using these tools of surveillance really to coordinate with private companies, unrestrained, of course, by the Fourth Amendment, and they're using them to waive your medical privacy and invade your personal privacy. They are looking for tools to monitor your movements, your associations, your activities, your behaviors, monitoring your behaviors everywhere you're going, who you're talking to, who you're associating with at this time. We also see this happening right now with the First Amendment, your right to assemble and your right to protest, because right now you have orders that have gone out across the country, again in cities and in states, saying you are not allowed to congregate in groups of 10 people or more. That is the limit that you're allowed to be in, and essentially saying you cannot gather together. Now, if that happens, that essentially blocks your right as a citizen to protest, to organize, or to assemble with other people, and it is a direct violation of your constitutional right. And you say, well, wait a minute, this is a dangerous thing. We have to be careful about people getting together. But government does not have the right to suspend your constitutional right, to suspend it by saying you do not have the right to gather right now. So essentially, you've killed off, by doing this, any ability for people to organize or to protest together, because doing so violates now orders that have been given on the municipal level and on the state level. I would remind you, as we go through this process, there will be people who will watch this video, I know, who will say, Ben, no, this is something that goes far beyond just these trivial matters of your First Amendment rights, your Fourth Amendment rights, your Second Amendment rights. But I would remind you today that your rights as an American citizen, the Bill of Rights, is far from trivial. And I would remind you that governments, again, love to take power and they never give it back. So we have to be very cautious during this time about what we are allowing government to do and what we are allowing them to seize. What powers are we allowing them to take from us? And certainly to call into question why they are taking those powers. And so we're watching the economy crash. We're watching people lose jobs and they don't have income right now. And we're watching all of it take place under the guise of we must be protected from this tremendous virus that could destroy life as we know it. Folks, I appreciate you watching this. Please share it on social media and remind people to stay vigilant. Coming up in the next couple of days, we're also going to take a look at something I've been talking about for some time. I've been warning for weeks now to watch out for these shutdowns and watch out for what's happening to the economy. And now a lot of other folks are starting to get on board with that, saying this virus, including the president himself, by the way, saying that this virus might not actually kill as many people as the effects that are being brought to the economy in terms of poverty and in terms of what might happen to people if they suddenly, we have unemployment of 30% and we have millions of people without jobs and an economy that's been wrecked as a result of this. We'll be taking a closer look at that coming up in future episodes. Again, thanks for watching. Be safe, be healthy, and stay vigilant.